I just bought $100,000 of someone else's debt. I paid $5,000 for it. That's 5 cents on the dollar. And here's the part
Hold
that
on
should
a
bother
second.
you. That person still owes the full 100,000, not 5,000, the full amount. So I bought a debt collection agency, and I've spent every day since then trying to decide how I feel about the math. I'm going to walk you through exactly how this industry works, including the part where I tell you something that cost me money to say out loud. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly how debt gets sold for pennies, why collecting even a fraction of it is wildly profitable, and why this is one of the most heavily regulated businesses I've ever touched. Let's start with the part that made my stomach drop. Here's how debt actually gets to me. A bank writes off an account as uncollectible. They've already given up, it's dead money on their books. So they bundle thousands of these accounts together and sell the whole portfolio. Credit card debt commonly sells for 4 to 7 cents on the dollar. Medical debt goes even cheaper, sometimes 1 to 5 cents. Really old debt, several years past due, can sell for less than a single cent on the dollar. Fresh debt, under 6 months old, is the premium stuff, 7 to 15 cents. I want to be very clear about what's happening here. The bank has decided this money is worthless enough to sell at 95% off, but the person who owes it still legally owes every single dollar. That gap between what I paid and what I can legally collect is the entire business. There's also a whole pricing logic behind why some debt costs more than other debt. Location matters. Debts from areas with stronger enforcement laws recover better, so they cost more. Debt type matters. Unsecured credit card debt sells cheap because it's volatile. Secured loans with collateral behind them command 15 to 30 cents on the dollar. Even the debtor's credit profile factors into the bid price. Buyers aren't gambling blindly. They're pricing risk with the same coldness as any insurance company. There's an entire bidding process behind this that most people never hear about. Creditors package their charged off accounts and run a competitive auction. Multiple debt buyers analyze the portfolio data and submit bids based on their own recovery models. Whoever believes they can collect the most or is willing to take the biggest risk wins the portfolio. It is functionally a stock market for other people's worst financial moments. I sat in on my first bidding process and genuinely didn't speak for the entire hour. So, how do you actually make money on debt everyone else gave up on? Here's the twist that runs this whole industry. I don't need most people to pay, I need a small fraction of people to pay. Agencies buying these portfolios typically expect 10 to 20% overall recovery. Some do better, some do worse, but nobody's expecting everyone to pay. Run that math with me on a $100,000 portfolio. I paid $5,000. If I recover just 20%, that's $20,000 collected, minus my $5,000 cost, minus operating expenses, and that's a real profit on a portfolio everyone else called worthless. The 80% who never pay a cent, they don't ruin my model, they are my model. This business only works at volume, which is why agencies buy portfolios of 1,000 accounts or more at a time. One account is a coin flip. 1,000 accounts is a statistical certainty. The actual day-to-day operation looks nothing like the movies either. It's a call center. Software, headsets, scripts, compliance monitoring, and recording every single conversation. Most of my staff cost is people making calls that go straight to voicemail. The economics only work because the software lets a small team touch thousands of accounts a month. Automated payment processing matters more than aggressive collectors, which surprised me genuinely. Every dollar I save on operational overhead is a dollar I don't need to squeeze out of someone in distress. There's a second way to run this business, and honestly, it's the one I sleep better with. Instead of buying debt outright, you work on contingency for the original creditor. They keep ownership. You just collect and you keep a percentage. Fresh debt under 90 days late pays around 15 to 25% of what you recover. Standard placement, 90 to 180 days, pays 25 to 35%. Aged debt 1 to 3 years old pays 35 to 50% because it's much harder to collect. Notice how the older and more hopeless the debt gets, the bigger my cut becomes. That's not a coincidence. That's the market pricing and how unlikely it is that anyone ever pays. All right, numbers aside, let's talk about the part that genuinely keeps me careful. This industry is governed by something called the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act. It exists for a reason, and that reason is that this business has a genuinely ugly history. There are hard rules about when I can call, what I can say, and how I have to verify a debt is real. Violate them, and I'm not looking at a slap on the wrist, I'm looking at lawsuits and losing my license. State licensing, bonding requirements, and compliance costs are not optional overhead here. They're the entire cost of being allowed to exist. Some states require separate licensing, surety bonds, and registered agents before I can make a single call to a resident there. Operating in 20 states means 20 separate compliance regimes running at once. I have a full-time compliance person whose entire job is making sure my collectors don't say the wrong sentence on a recorded line. That salary is not a nice to have. That salary is what stands between me and a class action lawsuit. And there's a genuinely uncomfortable dynamic I want to name directly. Because I bought that debt so cheaply, I have enormous room to negotiate. If someone calls me and pushes back politely, I can often settle for 30 to 50% off the balance and still make excellent money. Most people don't know that. They assume the number on the letter is final. It usually isn't. I want you to know that, even though telling you costs me money. Here's the honest reason I'm comfortable saying it. A settled account that actually gets paid is worth more to me than a full balance that never gets paid at all. 20% of something beats 100% of nothing every single time. The agencies that fight this reality end up with worse recovery rates and more lawsuits. The ones that negotiate reasonably collect more money with fewer complaints. It turns out the profitable strategy and the decent strategy overlap more than people assume. There's also a chain of resale that most people never see. Portfolios that don't perform get sold again to smaller agencies at even lower prices. The same debt can change hands multiple times, getting cheaper each time, while the balance the person owes never moves at all. This is where the industry gets genuinely messy. Each time a portfolio changes hands, documentation quality tends to degrade. Payment histories get lost, original contracts go missing, contact records go stale. By the fourth or fifth owner, some of those accounts are being pursued with almost no paper trail behind them, which is exactly the situation regulators created verification rules to prevent. Good agencies refuse to buy portfolios without proper documentation, both for legal safety and basic decency. Bad ones buy them precisely because they're cheap and hope nobody disputes anything. Let's put some real numbers to this because this is where the model becomes obvious. Say my agency buys a portfolio with a face value of $5 million. At 5 cents on the dollar, my acquisition cost is $250,000. Now let's run a realistic recovery. Say I collect 15% of face value across the whole portfolio. That's $750,000 collected. Subtract my $250,000 purchase cost. That leaves $500,000 gross. Now subtract operating costs, call center staff, compliance, software, legal review, licensing. Say those eat $300,000 across the year. I'm left with roughly $200,000 in profit on that single portfolio, on money that a bank had already written off as completely worthless. That $200,000 profit is a return of 80% on my acquisition cost. Try finding that return anywhere else in normal business. That's the number that draws people into this industry in the first place. It's also the number that makes people justify things they shouldn't justify, which is exactly the problem. Now let's run a bad portfolio because I've bought a few of those. Say the account documentation is poor, missing payment histories, outdated contact information, disputed balances. Poor documentation can cut a portfolio's recovery value by up to half. Suddenly I'm recovering 7% instead of 15%. That's $350,000 collected against the same $250,000 cost and the same $300,000 in operating expenses. I'm now down $200,000 on a portfolio I thought was a bargain. This is why the good buyers obsess over documentation quality before bidding, not after. You are not buying debt, you are buying the paperwork that proves the debt exists. I learned that the expensive way, which is apparently the only way I learn anything. I once bought a portfolio based purely on the face value number and the discount percentage. It looked incredible on the spreadsheet. The documentation behind it was a disaster. Half those accounts were effectively uncollectible because I couldn't properly verify them, which meant I legally shouldn't be pursuing them, and I didn't. That mistake cost me more than any aggressive collector could have ever recovered. So here's my honest take from a man who now reads compliance updates for fun, apparently. If you're buying a collection agency because it sounds like easy money, understand what you're actually signing up for. You're buying a highly regulated, volume-dependent, paperwork-obsessed business, where your profit depends on people in financial distress, paying money they already couldn't pay. That's a real thing to sit with. I'm not going to pretend it isn't. If you run it well, legally, and treat settlements fairly, it's a legitimate and necessary part of the credit system. If you run it badly, you deserve every lawsuit you get. I've met both kinds of operator in this industry, and the difference is obvious within about 5 minutes of conversation. One talks about recovery rates and documentation standards. The other talks about pressure tactics and how many calls per hour their team makes. Only one of those businesses is still around in 10 years. I bought a debt collection agency thinking I was buying an aggressive phone operation. What I actually bought was a documentation business with a very heavy conscience attached. If you want to see what happens when I buy the next uncomfortable business, subscribe because there's always a next one.